Question 15 says, what is the value of the expression below? And we're given an absolute value expression. The answers range from negative 18 to positive 18, and there are also pairs of negatives here. So A and E are negatives, and then also B and D are negatives of each other as well. Noticing these negative relationships, we'll want to be extra careful about our signs as we do this question, because it seems like the ACT might be predicting a mistake related to that. As far as the ACT math concepts in the prompt, it's just this absolute value expression. And then in terms of the solutions to this question, there are a couple different ways that we can approach it. One would be to use a more formal understanding of how absolute values work and just simplify this thing by hand. And then another approach would be to plug this expression into our calculator and see what the answer is. Both of those approaches can be very effective. I'm going to write them both out over here. So approaches, number one, the concrete way would be to plug expression into calculator. And then the second, the formal, is use knowledge of absolute values to simplify or to solve. As always, I'll start with the concrete solution first. And the reason I want to do that in particular on this question is because I want to reinforce our awareness of when the calculator actually can be used to really help us out, either to solve a question or to double check our formal understanding, just because a lot of times it won't even occur to test takers at first that they could plug this type of thing into their calculator. Now, that being said, definitely is important to understand the basics of how absolute values work for the ACT and also in general. So we'll also review that approach, and I'll link to resources about absolute values in the description if you'd like to practice or learn about those more. All right, so I'll pull up the calculator here, and to enter in absolute values on the TI-84, we're going to go to Math and then scroll to num, and then it's the very first thing is ABS, and if we click that, we'll get the absolute value bars. And from here, we'll actually create another set of absolute value bars to put this negative 8 plus 4 in. So I'm going to go back and then do it again, and we'll do negative 8 plus 4 there, and then we're also going to want to add this minus sign and then another set of absolute values. So math num ABS, and then 3 minus 9, and then that should be it. When we press enter, we get positive 2. So the correct answer here is D. Let's now look at the formal way of solving this, which is to use what we know about absolute values. And essentially the key idea here is that before we take an absolute value, we actually want to do the operations inside first. So we'll want to do the negative 8 plus 4 first, and negative 8 plus 4 is going to be negative 4. So we just put that inside the absolute values, and we still have this other larger absolute value on the outside. Then we have this minus. Now let's do the operation inside this absolute value next. We have 3 minus 9, which is going to be negative 6. So we'll put that inside the absolute value. We still have this other absolute value there. And then now that we have the final number inside the absolute value sign, we can go ahead and take the absolute value of that number. The absolute value of a number is essentially the magnitude of that number without regard to its sign. So for example, the magnitude of negative 4 without regard for the sign is just 4. So we can write this as 4, and then same thing for negative 6. The magnitude of that without regard for the sign is 6. So we have 4 minus, and then this is going to become 6. And again, we're in the situation where we're going to want to simplify the expression before we can take that final absolute value. 4 minus 6 is negative 2. So we write it like that. And then we're left with the absolute value of negative 2, which is going to be positive 2, like we got earlier. Let's take a look now at some of the wrong answers. Answer choice B of negative 2 is just the negative of our correct answer, and that could reflect not taking the final absolute value there. Answer choice C of 0 could reflect mistakenly thinking that this is going to be positive 8 and then making this into a positive 9, in which case we'd get 8 plus 4, which is 12, minus 3 plus 9, which is 12, and that would lead to 0. And then answer choices A and E of negative 18 and positive 18, we could get those through various combinations of the numbers here in the prompt, but they're kind of complicated to get, and the basic point is that they reflect not really understanding how absolute values work. All right, now let's think about what we ultimately needed to know for this question. So I'll type it out right here. Ultimately needed to know if solving it with our calculator, we didn't need to know any formal math. If using absolute values, we needed to know the basics of absolute value expressions. As far as the ultimate takeaways on this question, one of the major ones is the fact that we were able to use our calculator to entirely solve this. And I don't want to suggest that knowing the math here isn't important, because it definitely is important to know. And it's also not a good habit in general to just try to rely entirely on a calculator or to try to get by with superficial understanding or memorization of math concepts, both on this test and also in general when it comes to math. But our goal specifically for this test is to get as high a score as possible, and to the extent that being aware that certain questions can be made much easier with a calculator, or that we could check our formal understandings with a calculator, definitely can be a very helpful thing. In fact, for another example of a question where a calculator can come in handy computation-wise, check out question 25 from this test, because it also involves a similar approach. With all that said, though, if you're feeling shaky about absolute values, then definitely check out the resources in the description to review those in more depth. All right, with all that said, let's go on to question 16.